He took one look at the smoke pouring from his own kitchen window, and one look at the woman standing over the stove with a ruined skillet in her hand, and Dutch Pharaoh understood, with the particular sinking certainty of a man whose careful plans had gone thoroughly sideways, that the matrimonial agency had sent him the wrong bride entirely. "I asked for a cook," he said, standing in his own doorway with his hat still on, surveying the wreckage of what appeared to have once been intended as breakfast. The letter said experienced, capable, accustomed to ranch households. "And I am experienced and capable," said Beatrice Langford, setting the smoking skillet down with as much dignity as a woman covered in flour and regret could manage, "at teaching 30 children their letters and their sums in a one-room schoolhouse, which I will have you know is a considerably harder occupation than frying an egg, though I concede I have not yet mastered the egg." "You've set fire to it," Dutch said. "I have merely browned it enthusiastically," Beatrice said. "There is a difference, though I grant it is a narrow one this particular morning." Dutch Pharaoh was not, by nature or by reputation, a man given to patience with disorder. He had run the Kestrel Flats ranch alone for 6 years since his last hired cook had married off and left him to his own disastrous efforts at the stove, and he had written to the agency with a plain, specific request: a woman of practical skill, capable of managing a household, unafraid of hard work, uninterested in romantic nonsense. What stepped off the stage 3 days prior, trunk full of books and very little else, was a schoolteacher from a fine academy in the East with opinions on everything from the proper pronunciation of Latin phrases to the injustice of the territorial school board's funding, and apparently no practical notion whatsoever of how a stove functioned. "There's been some manner of mix-up," he said, "for perhaps the 5th time since her arrival. I expect the agency's confused my order with some other ranchers." "I expect they have," Beatrice agreed cheerfully, scraping the ruined eggs into the slop bucket without evident embarrassment. "Though I did sign the agreement in good faith, Mr. Pharaoh, and I intend to honor it, egg-related catastrophes notwithstanding. I simply propose we discover, between us, precisely what use a schoolteacher can be made on a cattle ranch, since cooking appears, regrettably, to be off the table. Or rather, several unfortunate things have been off the table this week, my cooking chief among them." Dutch found, against his considerable inclination toward irritation, that he was fighting a smile, and scowled harder to compensate. "This is a working ranch, Miss Langford, not a schoolroom." "No," she agreed, "but you've 11 hands on this ranch by my count, 4 of them married with children who by your own admission haven't seen the inside of a proper schoolhouse in 2 years, since the nearest one's a full day's ride. I noticed the accounts ledger open on your desk last evening, Mr. Pharaoh, and I noticed, too, that your arithmetic on the feed calculations was off by a considerable sum in the hand's favor. I may burn an egg beyond recognition, but I have never in my life made an error in a column of figures." He had not expected that. "You looked at my ledger?" "It was open on the desk," she said, entirely unrepentant. "I am a naturally curious woman, Mr. Pharaoh, which I understand is not a quality you ordered, but which I'm afraid came included regardless." The second morning went little better than the first. Beatrice attempted biscuits that emerged from the oven with the density and approximate flavor of river stones, and served a stew so thoroughly over-salted that even the ranch dog, a notoriously indiscriminate eater named Duke, declined a second helping after careful consideration. Dutch ate 3 spoonfuls out of what he later admitted was pure stubborn pride, then set down his spoon with the resigned expression of a man conceding a battle he had already lost. "I don't suppose the agency mentioned any particular talent you do possess," he said, "beyond Latin pronunciation and a fondness for other people's ledgers." "I can recite the entire list of English monarchs in order," Beatrice offered, "and I am considered, by several reliable sources, an excellent judge of poetry. I can also, if pressed, explain the fundamentals of geometry to a reasonably attentive pig, should the need ever arise on a ranch such as this one. We've no shortage of pigs," Dutch allowed, "but I confess I'd hoped for something a touch more immediately useful to a working cattle operation." "Patience, Mr. Pharaoh," Beatrice said, entirely unbothered. "I have found that usefulness reveals itself in its own good time. provided a person is not too set in their ways to notice it when it arrives. He hired Consuela Reyes from the neighboring ranch to handle the cooking within the week. A practical solution neither of them discussed as anything but practical, and in the space that opened up, Beatrice set herself, with the same brisk enthusiasm she had once brought to a schoolroom of 30 unruly children, to reorganizing every system on the Kestrel Flats ranch that had been managed by guesswork and habit. She corrected the feed accounts. She began teaching the hands children letters in the empty bunkhouse of an afternoon, gathering a startled but grateful cluster of 6 young pupils who had not seen a lesson book in years. She read aloud in the evenings from a battered volume of Shakespeare to anyone who cared to listen, which turned out, to Dutch's considerable surprise, to include himself, sitting stiff and silent in the corner with his coffee gone cold, unwilling to admit he was listening at all. "You've got a strange notion of what a rancher needs," Dutch said one evening, some 3 weeks into her residence, watching her mark sums on a slate for a boy of 9 who had never once been asked to try. "I've got a strange notion of what any household needs," Beatrice said, "which is not, generally speaking, only bread on the table, but some manner of thinking going on in the heads gathered around it. You may have ordered a cook, Mr. Farrow, but I'd wager the agency sent you precisely what this ranch was actually lacking, whether either of us cares to admit it plainly." She had by then also taken to correcting the small injustices she noticed scattered about the ranch with the same brisk confidence she brought to a wayward multiplication table. She discovered that one of the hands, a quiet young man named Otis, had never learned to read at all, and had been hiding the fact for years out of shame. She began teaching him his letters in secret after supper, and within a month he was labeling the tack room shelves himself, beaming with a pride that startled even him. She noticed that the ranch's supply orders were miscounted nearly every month for want of anyone checking the arithmetic twice, and took over the task herself without being asked, saving Dutch, by his own grudging calculation, nearly $40 across a single season. "You've made yourself indispensable to a ranch that never asked for a schoolteacher," Dutch observed one evening, watching her tally figures by lamplight with the same fierce concentration she brought to everything. "I've made myself indispensable to a ranch that didn't know what it was missing," Beatrice corrected, without looking up, which I find is generally how the most useful things arrive in a person's life: rarely requested, frequently resisted, ultimately essential. "I've managed 6 years without a schoolteacher underfoot," Dutch said, though there was less bite in it than there might once have been. "And I dare say you've managed poorly," Beatrice said, with the particular fond bluntness that had, without either of them quite marking the moment, become the accustomed tone between them, which is precisely why the agency, in its infinite and mysterious wisdom, saw fit to send you me instead. It was in the 5th week, during the driest stretch of a punishing summer, that the mismatch between them stopped mattering entirely, because a grass fire broke out along the western fence line where a careless spark from a hand's cook fire had caught in tinder-dry brush. And within the hour it had grown into a wall of flame racing toward both the main herd and the bunkhouse where, Beatrice realized with a jolt of pure terror, 3 of her young pupils had been left napping in the afternoon heat while their fathers fought fire at the fence line. "The children," she said, already running before she had finished the sentence, and Dutch, catching sight of the smoke thickening black and fast toward the bunkhouse roof, ran with her. "Get them out the south window," he shouted over the roar of approaching flame. The door sides catching, Beatrice was through the bunkhouse door before he finished speaking, coughing already in the gathering smoke, gathering the 3 small, frightened children into her arms with a strength she had not known she possessed. Herding them toward the window Dutch had already forced open from outside. "One at a time," she said, forcing calm into her voice for the children's sake though her own heart hammered wild against her ribs. "Quickly now. Mr. Farrow's got you," and passed the first small boy through the window into Dutch's waiting arms, then the second, then the smallest girl, who screamed and clung until Beatrice pried her gently loose and pushed her through to safety. The roof beam above the door gave way just as Beatrice herself scrambled through the window, Dutch's hands closing hard around her arms to haul her the last desperate distance clear of the collapsing frame, and they went down together in the dirt of the yard, coughing, singed and entirely gloriously alive, the bunkhouse roaring into full collapse behind them not 5 seconds after the last of them cleared it. "You could have died in there," Dutch said, still holding her, his voice rough with something that was not merely relief, once he had confirmed with his own frantic hands that she was whole and breathing, running into a burning building for children that aren't even yours. "They've been mine every afternoon for 5 weeks, Beatrice said, coughing smoke from her lungs. "Whatever the agency's paperwork says about my actual employment here, I wasn't about to leave them to burn while I stood outside minding whether it was proper for a schoolteacher to play rescuer." The fire was contained by nightfall, thanks to the hands' desperate work at the fence line and a lucky shift of wind, and the ranch survived with nothing lost but the bunkhouse itself, easily enough rebuilt. Consuela wept openly when she found her own daughter among the 3 children Beatrice had carried through the window, and pressed Beatrice's soot-blackened hands between her own for a long, wordless moment that said more than any speech could have managed. Otis. The young hand Beatrice had taught to read in secret stood at the edge of the yard staring at the smoking ruin of the bunkhouse with an expression of fierce, protective gratitude, and later told anyone who would listen that the schoolteacher had more nerve than any 3 ranch hands put together. But something in Dutch Faro had shifted more permanently than any structure of wood and nails, and he found himself standing outside Beatrice's door that night, hat in hand, feeling considerably more nervous than he had felt facing down the fire itself. "I ordered a cook," he said, when she opened the door to find him there, soot still smudged along his jaw, "and I've spent 5 weeks telling myself, and anyone fool enough to ask, that the agency sent me the wrong woman entirely." "You have mentioned it once or twice," Beatrice said dryly, though her voice was gentler than her words. "I was wrong," Dutch said. "Dead wrong, and I mean to say it plain since I nearly lost the chance to say it at all this afternoon. This ranch didn't need a woman who could fry an egg without setting the kitchen ablaze. It needed a woman with the sense to teach children their letters, the nerve to run into a burning building without a second's hesitation, and the plain stubborn honesty to tell a set-in-his-ways rancher when his arithmetic and his notions both wanted correcting. I ordered a cook, Miss Langford, and what I got instead was considerably better than anything I knew enough to ask for." Beatrice felt something warm and unsteady rise in her chest, quite unlike anything a ledger of figures had ever produced in her. "That is, Mr. Faro, very nearly the closest thing to poetry I have heard out of you in 5 weeks. Don't expect it often," Dutch said, though the corner of his mouth had gone soft in a way she had come to watch for. "I'm a rancher, not a scholar. But I've come to think a ranch runs a good deal better with a bit of scholarship mixed into the cattle sense, and I find I'm not eager to send you back to the agency and start the whole mismatched business over with someone else." "Are you asking me to stay on in some official capacity?" Beatrice asked. "Or are you asking me something else entirely, Mr. Faro, and simply too set in your ways to say it plainly?" "I'm asking you to marry me," Dutch said with the same blunt directness he brought to everything else, properly this time, not by an agency's paperwork mix-up, but because I've worked these 5 weeks and can't rightly picture the ranch, or myself, without you in it any longer. I'll not pretend I know what I'm doing, courting a schoolteacher. I only know I'd be a fool to let one this fine slip back onto the next eastbound stage." Beatrice laughed, bright and unguarded, the particular laugh of a woman who has stopped bracing for disappointment and started, cautiously, to believe in something better. "I came west expecting to teach children their sums, Mr. Faro, and instead find myself agreeing to marry a rancher who ordered a cook and got, by his own admission, considerably more trouble than he bargained for. Best trouble I've had in 6 years, Dutch said, and kissed her there on the porch step, soot and smoke and all, sealing a match that had begun in an agency's careless error and become, against every reasonable expectation either of them had carried west, exactly the marriage each of them had needed all along. They were married within the month in a ceremony held in the ranch yard itself rather than any proper church, since Beatrice declared she could think of no more fitting place to make her vows than the very ground where she had first proven herself worth keeping. Consuela baked the wedding cake, refusing absolutely to let the bride near the oven for any purpose whatsoever, and the hands' children, Beatrice's small pupils among them, scattered wildflowers along the porch steps with the solemn seriousness only children can bring to such occasions. Otis stood up during the small reception that followed, with a confidence that would have been unthinkable a season before, read aloud a short verse he had composed himself in Beatrice's honor, stumbling only once over a difficult word before correcting himself and finishing strong. To the loud and genuine applause of every hand on the ranch, Dutch, watching from beside his new wife, found himself unexpectedly moved by the sight of a boy who could not read a supply label 3 months before now standing tall enough to recite his own verse before a crowd, and reached for Beatrice's hand without quite meaning to, needing simply to hold something solid while his heart ran ahead of his usual composure. "You did that," he murmured to her low enough for only her to hear. "Whatever else this ranch gained when the agency sent me the wrong bride, it gained that boy's confidence. And I don't reckon there's a column of figures in creation that could properly total what that's worth. Add it to the ledger anyway," Beatrice said, smiling against his shoulder. "I find I've grown rather fond of accounting for things that matter." They rebuilt the bunkhouse that autumn with a proper schoolroom added onto one end, and Kestrel Flats became, within a year, the only ranch in the county where the Hands children learned their letters before they learned to rope, and where Beatrice Farrow, formerly Langford, still could not fry an egg to save her own life, and had, by unanimous and cheerful household agreement, long since stopped needing to.